The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day of blinding Denver sun and the distant hum of traffic. It was an anomaly in my mailbox, which was usually crammed with junk mail and photography magazines. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and bore the letterhead of a law firm I'd never heard of. Blackwood, Finch and Associates, based in a town I had to look up on my phone, Port Fogg, Maine. The name itself sounded like a joke, a parody of a New England horror setting. I slid it open with my thumb, expecting a scam or a misdirected piece of mail. The legalese was dense, but the core message was clear. A woman named Ilara Halt, my great-aunt, had passed away. I had a vague childhood memory of my father mentioning a reclusive aunt on the East Coast, a woman who'd had a falling out with the family generations ago and was never spoken of again. According to the lawyer, a Mr. Finch, this woman had left me, her sole surviving blood relative, her entire estate. This consisted of a house and the property it sat on, an inheritance from a ghost. My first thought, the pragmatic one that always surfaced, was about the property value. A coastal house in Maine. Even a fixer-upper could be worth a small fortune. It was enough to justify a cross-country drive. I packed my camera gear first, out of habit, then enough clothes for a week. The drive east was a slow geographic bleed. The jagged, proud peaks of the Rockies softened into the endless, soul-flattening plains of Nebraska and Iowa, a sea of corn and soy under a sky too big for its own good. Then came the rolling green hills and dense forests of the Midwest, and finally, the ancient knotted woods of New England. The air changed. The dry, crisp mountain air I was used to was replaced by something heavy, damp, and briny. It smelled of salt, wet earth, and millennia of decay. I was entering a different country. The turnoff for Port Fogg was a narrow two-lane road that splintered from the main highway and immediately plunged into a forest of colossal pine trees. Their branches knitted together overhead, creating a perpetual twilight even in the middle of the afternoon. The fog rolled in without warning. One moment, I could see a quarter-mile of asphalt ahead. The next, my world was reduced to a 20-foot bubble of gray. It was thick as cotton, muffling the sound of my engine and swallowing the light from my headlamps. When the first buildings of the town emerged from the haze, they looked like phantoms. Weather-beaten, salt-bleached structures huddled together as if for warmth against the oppressive Atlantic. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant, mournful clang of a buoy bell. I pulled up to the only visible business, a general store with a faded sign that read Calder's Mercantile. A single gas pump stood outside, looking like a relic from the 1970s. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sawdust and cured meat. A handful of locals, 3 men in flannel shirts and a woman with a face as wrinkled as a topographical map, stopped their quiet conversations and turned to stare at me. It wasn't simple curiosity. It was a deep, unwavering, and distinctly hostile scrutiny. They looked at me as if I were a disease that had just walked in the door. I grabbed a bottle of water and a map of the town, paying the stone-faced clerk who didn't say a word, just slid my change across the worn wooden counter. The collective weight of their stares followed me out the door. The Holt house was exactly where the lawyer's map indicated. At the end of a winding dirt road, perched on a rocky cliff overlooking the churning gray ocean. It was a 2-story structure, its wooden siding weathered to a dark, almost black finish, with a steep gabled roof that looked like a witch's hat. It was larger than I'd expected, and despite its age, seemed structurally sound. The foundation was made of massive, dark stones that looked as if they'd been hewn from the cliff itself. The place didn't feel abandoned. It felt like it was waiting. The key Meister Finch had mailed me turned smoothly in the lock. The air that rushed out from inside was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of dried herbs and old paper. The interior was surprisingly well kept. The furniture, heavy dark wood pieces, was covered in white sheets like sleeping ghosts. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the grimy windows. It was a time capsule. But as my eyes adjusted, I started noticing the details. On the inside of the heavy front door was a massive hand-forged iron bolt. It was a brutish thing, as thick as my wrist. I checked the back door and found another identical one. Then I went from window to window on the ground floor. Each one had a similar, albeit smaller, iron latch drilled directly into the frame. These weren't for keeping a draft out or for security against common burglars. They were designed to withstand a siege, and they were all on the inside. My pragmatic mind tried to rationalize it. Hurricane protection, maybe. But it felt wrong. Deeply wrong. In a heavy oak desk in what must have been a study, tucked away in a drawer, I found it. A leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth with age. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant, a beautiful flowing script from a bygone era. It was my great-aunt Ilara's diary. The first several entries were mundane. Notes on the weather, the tides, the garden she was tending. They painted a picture of a solitary but peaceful life. I kept reading, skipping through the pages. The tone began to shift. The entries became shorter, the handwriting more frantic. October 12th. The harvest moon is full. A bad time. The air is tense. They are watching from the trees. I can feel their hunger. October 14th. The bolts held last night. The scratching went on for hours. A sound like claws on stone. God, the sound. November 3rd. Another one gone from town. Old man Hemlock. They said he wandered off into the woods. He knew better. They all know better. But they blame us. They always blame us. The last entry was a barely legible scrawl. They are getting smarter. The iron is a deterrent, not a cage. They know my blood is thin. They can smell the end of the line. I closed the book, my hand trembling slightly. It was the stuff of local ghost stories, the ramblings of an old woman succumbing to dementia in isolation. It had to be. I was a photographer from Denver. I dealt in facts, in images, in light and shadow, not in things that scratch at the door in the dead of night. That evening, I unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor of the main room, too unsettled to try the beds upstairs. The sun went down and the fog pressed in against the windows, erasing the world outside. The silence of the house was absolute. And then I heard it. It started deep in the woods that bordered the property, a low, guttural sound that rose in pitch to a full-throated howl. I've spent enough time in the Rockies to know what a wolf sounds like, what a coyote sounds like. This was neither. It was too deep, too powerful, and filled with a terrifying, resonant intelligence. It wasn't the cry of a simple animal hunting for food. It was a declaration, a threat. A chill that had nothing to do with the coastal air crept over my skin, raising every hair on my arms and the back of my neck. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive silence. An ancient primal part of my brain, a part I didn't know existed, screamed a single silent word: danger. The howl echoed again, closer this time, and I found myself staring at the thick iron bolt on the front door, suddenly grateful for an old woman's paranoia. I spent the next morning chain-drinking coffee and rereading the diary, trying to dissect Ilara's words with the cold logic of a man who didn't believe in monsters. But the more I read, the less sense the logical world made. She never used words like werewolf or vampire. Her language was older, more personal. "It is the blood," one entry read. "The Halt blood. It is not a curse," my mother told me, "but a key. It unlocks the night. The moon is not our master, but our confidant. It lends us its sight, its silence. But this gift makes us anathema to the others, the ones who truly are cursed." She wrote of a family sickness that made them sensitive to the moon and strong in the dark. She detailed what she called the guardians of the forest, a name dripping with a bitter irony. "They call themselves guardians," she wrote, "but they are prisoners. They guard nothing but their own rage, and they hate us for it. They hate us for what we are and what they have become. They smell our blood and see not a key but a chain they wish to break." I dismissed it as elaborate folklore, the product of a lonely mind. But then I started noticing things. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent, the world came into a focus I had never experienced before. I stood on the cliff behind the house and I could see individual shingles on a fishing boat that was at least a mile out at sea. The complex pattern of a spider's web in a bush 10 feet away was as clear as a blueprint. The sounds were the most disorienting. I could hear the scuttling of a crab on the rocks below the cliff, the whisper of the wind through a specific cluster of pine needles, the frantic papery flutter of a moth's wings inside the house behind me. It was a sensory overload, a flood of information that was both exhilarating and nauseating. And then there was the light. The brilliant afternoon sun, which I'd basked in my entire life in Colorado, now felt like a physical assault. It hammered against my skull, triggering a blistering migraine that forced me back into the shadows of the house. In the dim interior, the pain subsided, and the world snapped back into that impossible high-definition clarity. A horrible, creeping suspicion began to take root in my mind. That evening, desperate for a dose of normalcy and a stiff drink, I drove back into town. The only bar was a place called the Salty Dog, a dimly lit dive that smelled of stale beer and fried fish. The same hostile silence fell as I walked in. I took a seat at the bar and ordered a whiskey. The bartender was an old man, his face a road map of wrinkles, his eyes a faded, watery blue. He slid the drink to me without a word. "Quiet town," I said, trying to break the ice. He just grunted, wiping down the counter with a dirty rag. "I'm staying out at the old Halt place," I added. "My great aunt's." This got a reaction. The bartender froze. His eyes flicked up to meet mine in the mirror behind the bar. A flicker of something. Pity. Fear. Crossed his face before being extinguished. He leaned in, his voice a low rasp that was barely audible. "A Halt! Haven't had one of you here in a long time." He glanced around the bar at the other patrons who were pretending not to listen. "Some advice, kid. You keep to your house, and you don't go walking in those woods after sundown. Especially not when the moon is high. Some things out there, they don't take kindly to strangers, especially not your kind." He said nothing more, turning his back on me and pointedly ignoring my attempts to ask what he meant. I finished my whiskey, the liquid burning a trail to my stomach, and left, the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on my back. The drive back to the house was tense. The sun had set, and the world was bathed in a deep indigo twilight. My new, enhanced senses were on high alert. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig from the woods beside the road, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. As I rounded the final bend before the house, my headlights cut through the gloom and landed on something in the middle of the road. It was a figure. For a split second, my brain registered it as a man, but it was all wrong. It was tall, impossibly so, but hunched over, its arms hanging down so low its knuckles nearly scraped the asphalt. The limbs were too long, the joints bent at unnatural angles. It was a silhouette of pure wrongness. Before I could process what I was seeing, before I could even slam on the brakes, it unfolded with a terrifying fluid grace and vanished into the trees. There was no sound, just a flicker of movement, and it was gone. I slammed the car to a halt, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. The fog was thin here. It wasn't a trick of the light. I had seen it. Back in the oppressive safety of the house, I bolted the door and went straight for the cellar, needing to do something, anything, to feel in control. The cellar was cold and damp, smelling of earth and the sea. In the far corner, tucked under a canvas tarp, was a large, iron-bound chest. It wasn't locked. I heaved the heavy lid open. Inside, nestled in rotting velvet, was an arsenal. There were 3 daggers with long, elegant blades that shone with a soft, white luster. Silver, I realized with a jolt. There were also a dozen vials filled with a thick, viscous, dark red liquid. A small, leather-bound book was tucked beside them. It was a sort of alchemical ledger detailing the contents of the vials. It was a concentrate, a distillation of herbs and unsettlingly blood. The notes claimed it would sharpen the senses to a razor's edge and lend the sinews the strength of aged oak for a short time. I ran back upstairs, my mind reeling, and grabbed Ilara's diary again, flipping to the later entries. They tested the west wall again last night. 3 of them. They are working together now, not like the feral beasts of my grandfather's time. They are learning. The iron holds. The iron always holds. But for how long? They can smell me. They know I am the last. The howl from the woods, the figure on the road, the bartender's warning, the silver knives and iron bolts, the impossible changes in my own body. The diary entries about a bloodline that was strong in the dark and a hated enemy that hunted them. My pragmatic, modern mind fought a losing battle against the encroaching, terrifying truth. These weren't the ravings of a madwoman. They were a survival guide. And the things she was trying to survive were not just real. They were outside, in the woods, waiting. And now, they were waiting for me. The next morning, I drove to the one place in any town that hoards secrets, the library. The Port Fog Public Library was a small, squat building of gray stone, hunkered down near the harbor as if trying to hide from the incessant wind. The air inside was a comforting mix of old paper, binding glue, and the faint, briny scent of the sea that seeped through the window frames. It was an oasis of quiet in a town that was already far too quiet. Behind a large wooden circulation desk sat a woman who looked as much a part of the building as the books themselves. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, framed by a cascade of silver hair pinned up in a loose bun. A small brass plaque on the desk read, "Miss Audrey Pendergast, librarian." She watched me approach, her expression neutral, but her gaze intensely focused. Unlike the others in town, there was no overt hostility, just a deep, penetrating curiosity. "Can I help you?" Her voice was crisp, educated. "I hope so," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm looking for information on local history. Folklore, legends, that sort of thing." "A tourist?" she asked, one eyebrow arching slightly. "Something like that. I'm staying out at the Halt place. It belonged to my great-aunt." The name landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped in a well. Audrey's professional mask dissolved, replaced by a look of profound seriousness. The curiosity in her eyes sharpened into something that looked alarmingly like recognition. She stood up, her movements precise. "Wait here," she commanded, and disappeared into the towering shelves of the archives. She returned a few minutes later, carrying a single, heavy, leather-bound book. It had no title on its spine. She placed it on the counter with a soft thud. "This is a collection of local histories and tales compiled by my great-grandfather. You won't find it in the public catalog. I think you'll find what you're looking for in the chapter titled The Two Kin." I took the book to a secluded table in the corner and opened it. The pages were brittle, the text a mix of handwritten notes and faded typescript. The chapter Audrey had mentioned told a story that was far more than a simple folktale. It spoke of the first settlers who arrived on this jagged piece of coastline centuries ago. Among them were the founders of two distinct families, two bloodlines that were ancient even then, carrying a power and a curse from the old world. One was the Night Kin, a family who, the book said, drew their strength from the quiet dark and the silver light of the moon. The text described them as having senses that could pierce the veil of night, granting them vision in darkness and the ability to hear a leaf fall a mile away. They possessed a subtle strength and a preternatural silence. The book was clear they were not evil. They were described as reclusive, watchful, and bound by an ancient duty to maintain a balance. As I read, a cold dread washed over me. It was a perfect, terrifying description of what was happening to my own body. The other family was the Beastkin. The book's tone shifted, becoming darker, more fearful. This bloodline was described as being bound not to the moon's quiet light, but to its savage, primal fury. They were cursed, the text said, to lose their humanity under its glow, their forms twisting into monstrous parodies of man and wolf. The book called them lichens, but a handwritten note in the margin had crossed it out and scribbled a more local term: moonhounds. They were driven by rage, hunger, and a deep-seated hatred for the Nightkin, whose control and quiet power they envied and despised. Then came the final, devastating paragraph. It was a legend, the author noted, but one told with grim conviction by the town's elders for generations. The legend claimed that the blood of the last of the Nightkin held a unique power. If willingly given, it could cure the Beastkin of their affliction, freeing them from the moon's madness. But if taken by force, it would not cure them. It would instead amplify their power tenfold, shattering the last vestiges of their human conscience and turning them into unstoppable monsters. My blood. They weren't just hunting me. I was the ultimate prize. I felt a presence beside me and looked up. It was Audrey. She had a somber, almost pitying look on her face. "You see now, don't you?" she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. "The Halts were the last of the Nightkin," she continued, her eyes locked on mine. "Ilara was the end of the line, or so everyone believed. She never had children, never married. When she died, they thought the bloodline was gone forever. They thought they were safe from temptation, free to live with their curse as they always had." She leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower. "Your arrival here. A Halt with the old blood flowing in your veins. It was like a bell tolling in the dead of night, waking every hungry ghost in the valley. They know you're here, and they will not stop." Her words hung in the air, heavy and final. I left the library in a daze, the world outside seeming both surreal and terrifyingly real. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and blood red. I drove back to the house on autopilot, my mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. Vampires and werewolves. It was the stuff of cheap novels, of bad movies. It couldn't be real. But that night, the fiction became undeniable fact. I was in the study, the silver daggers from the chest laid out on the desk before me when the attack began. It wasn't a single howl this time, but a chorus of them, erupting from the tree line, closer and more frenzied than before. Then came a heavy, sickening thud against the front door, making the entire house shudder. Another followed, and another, a relentless, percussive assault. I ran to the living room just in time to hear the splintering of wood as the thick oak of the door began to crack under the tremendous force. Then came the scraping. A high-pitched, grating sound of claws digging into the wood around the windows, searching for purchase, for a weakness. I backed away, my heart pounding in my ears, and looked at the front window. A face materialized from the darkness outside, pressed against the glass. It was a nightmarish fusion of man and beast. The snout was elongated lupine with lips pulled back in a snarl to reveal rows of yellowed fangs. But the eyes were the worst. They were intelligent, calculating, and burned with a malevolent, glowing yellow light. They stared right at me, filled with a promise of visceral, bloody violence. The creature let out a guttural roar, and I saw its massive, clawed hand rear back. I threw myself to the floor as it smashed through the window, sending a shower of glass across the room. But it couldn't get through. The old wrought iron bars my great-aunt had installed held fast. The beast roared in frustration, its hot, foul breath misting in the cold night air. The iron bolts and bars were the only things between me and them. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they would spend all night trying to tear them down. Dawn broke gray and silent. The assault had ended as abruptly as it began, melting away with the first hint of morning light. I spent the next hour in a state of adrenaline-fueled shock, pacing the debris-strewn living room. When the sun was fully up, I cautiously unbolted the door and stepped outside. The evidence of the night's siege was horrifying. The front door was a ruin of splintered wood, held together only by its iron hinges and the internal bolt. Deep, gouge-like claw marks scarred the siding all around the ground floor windows. And in the soft earth beneath the broken window, I found a patch of coarse gray and black fur snagged on a rose bush. It felt wiry and foul. The fear from the night before was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now overlaid with something new, a chilling, clear-headed resolve. Audrey's words echoed in my mind. They knew I was here. They could smell my blood. Running was pointless. Where would I even go? If a pack of werewolves in rural Maine could sense my arrival, they could certainly hunt me down. This house, this cliff, this isolated piece of rock my ancestor had claimed. It wasn't a prison. It was a fortress, and I was now its sole defender. My old life, the life of Halt, the Denver photographer who worried about gallery shows and shutter speeds, had ended the moment I read that lawyer's letter. That man was a ghost. My acceptance of this new reality was punctuated by a bizarre, terrifying incident. In the study, trying to make sense of Ilara's diary, I reached for a book on a high shelf. My foot slipped on the rug, and I stumbled backward into a tall, heavy bookcase filled with leather-bound volumes. I saw it tilt. A slow-motion disaster. A 500-pound cascade of wood and paper destined to crush me. I threw up a hand not to stop it, but as a useless, reflexive gesture. But my hand didn't just hit the bookcase. It stopped it. My palm connected with the solid oak, and the massive piece of furniture, which had been past the point of no return, halted its fall with a deep groan. There was no strain, no tearing muscle, just an instinctive surge of power that flooded my arm. I pushed, and the bookcase settled back into place against the wall with a soft thud. I stood there, staring at my own hand, my fingers trembling. It wasn't an adrenaline surge, it was something more. The strength of aged oak, as the alchemical ledger had described it. The blood was awake. This new reality galvanized me. I was no longer a victim waiting for the next attack. I was a participant. I went back down to the iron chest in the cellar. The silver daggers felt unnaturally light, perfectly balanced in my hand. I looked again at the vials of dark liquid. Alara's notes in the ledger were meticulous. She'd refined the formula over decades. It was a temporary amplifier, a dangerous one. Overuse could lead to a fever of the blood. It was a tool for emergencies, not a crutch. Later that day, armed with this new sense of purpose, I called Audrey. I needed a name. I needed a face to put to the monster. "They're not just beasts," I said, my voice low and urgent. "Last night, they were coordinated. Someone was leading them." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You need to be careful, Kaylin," she finally said, her voice fraught with worry. "The leader of the pack is not some wild hermit in the woods. He's the most powerful man in this town. His name is Lachlan Cormac. He owns the lumber mill. To most people, he's a pillar of the community. Generous, hard-working, a man who provides jobs and keeps this town from blowing away. He's been the alpha of his family for 30 years. Lachlan Cormac. The name felt like a stone in my gut. "What does he want?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. What all desperate men want. A cure or ultimate power. He's old for one of them. He's seen his curse passed down through generations. He's tired of it. But he's also proud. He won't kneel and ask for your help. He'll tear it from your throat. Against my better judgment and against what Audrey would surely advise, I had to see him. I got in my car and drove towards the lumber mill on the other side of town. I didn't go onto the property. I parked on a ridge overlooking the sprawling complex of sheds, smokestacks, and vast pyramids of raw timber. Through my camera's telephoto lens, I scanned the yard. I saw him almost immediately. He stood out from the other workers not just because he wasn't operating any machinery, but because of the sheer force of his presence. Lachlan Cormac was a big man, broad-shouldered with a thick neck and a mane of iron gray hair. He moved with a predatory confidence, an absolute certainty that this was his territory and everyone on it was his to command. As if he could feel my gaze from half a mile away, he stopped and slowly turned his head, his eyes scanning the wooded ridge where I was hidden. Our eyes met through the lens. It was only for a second, but it was enough. I felt it like a physical blow, a wave of pure, undiluted malice, a primal hatred that transcended human emotion. It was the ancient enmity of two species, a promise of violence that needed no words. He couldn't have possibly seen me, not really, but he knew. He knew I was there, and his lips curled back in a silent, wolfish snarl. I lowered the camera, my hands shaking. The cold resolve I'd felt this morning now seemed like a child's bravado. This wasn't just a monster. This was a king in his castle, a general with an army of beasts at his command. I couldn't just sit in the house and wait for him to tear it down around me. Defense wasn't enough. I had to fight back. I had to find a way to hunt the hunter. The days that followed were a blur of frenzied education. I became a scholar of my own unnatural biology, with Alara's diary as my only textbook. I abandoned sleep during the day, forcing myself to be active only in the twilight and dark hours, conditioning my body to its new rhythm. The house became my training ground. I learned to move through its shadowy rooms with absolute silence, my heightened hearing my guide. I could hear the groan of a floorboard before I put my weight on it, the subtle shift in air pressure as a door swung open. I practiced controlling the surges of strength, lifting heavy furniture with slow, deliberate movements instead of explosive bursts. I was relearning how to exist inside my own skin. My weaknesses became just as apparent. I discovered by accident what pure silver felt like. While cleaning one of the daggers from the cellar chest, the edge of it grazed my thumb. The pain was instantaneous and shocking, a searing chemical burn that was wholly alien. A black sizzling line appeared on my skin, and the wound was slow to heal. Sunlight was a more insidious enemy. It didn't burn me to ash, but prolonged exposure left me feeling weak, disoriented, and nauseous, my enhanced senses dulled to a painful static buzz. The world of light was no longer my own. Audrey became my lifeline. She couldn't teach me how to be what I was, but she could teach me about my enemy. Breaking her own rules, she started visiting the house after dark, her small car chugging up the dirt road, its headlights cutting a defiant path through the gloom. She brought supplies, canned goods, bottled water, and more importantly, knowledge. Her family, she explained, had not been part of the two kin, but had served as watchers for centuries, neutral chroniclers of the secret war that raged in Portfog's forests. She spread old hand-drawn maps across the dining room table. The moonhounds are creatures of habit and territory, she explained, her finger tracing the faint lines. They have hunting paths, sacred grounds, but they also have places they avoid. She tapped a spot deep in the woods. This is the old quarry. The stone there is rich in iron deposits. They find it unpleasant. And here, she tapped another area, the soil is full of wolfsbane. It grows wild. It won't kill them, but it sickens them, makes them weak. She was giving me a battlefield advantage, a way to navigate a war I was hopelessly unprepared for. The psychological warfare began a few nights later. Lachlan and his pack were done with brute force for now. They were trying to break my mind. It started with gifts left on my doorstep, a deer, its throat torn out, its body still warm. Then a sheep from a nearby farm disemboweled. They were offerings and threats, reminders of their power. The howls started again, but they were different now. They were closer, more taunting. Sometimes a single howl would rise from just beyond the tree line, a chillingly personal serenade. They were trying to unnerve me, to exhaust me, to make me make a mistake. I knew I couldn't stay locked inside forever. I had to see them on their own terms, in their own territory. One moonless night, armed with one of the silver daggers and a vial of the dark concentrate tucked into my pocket, I slipped out the back door and into the woods. I moved with the silence I had been practicing, my senses on fire. The forest at night was no longer a place of fear. It was a symphony of information. I could smell the damp earth, the pine sap, the trail of a fox that had passed an hour before. I could hear the frantic heartbeat of a field mouse hiding in the undergrowth 30 feet away. I followed a barely there game trail deeper into the woods, heading toward a ridge Audrey had marked as a common hunting ground. That's when I saw them. There were 4 of them, gathered in a small clearing. They were not the Hollywood monsters I'd half expected. They were worse. They stood on 2 legs, their forms horrifically twisted. Their bodies were covered in coarse fur, but their powerful musculature was still visible beneath. Their hands were a nightmare of elongated fingers tipped with thick, black claws. They were massive, easily 7 feet tall even when hunched, and moved with a terrifying combination of animal grace and brute strength. They were communicating in a series of guttural growls and snarls, a language of pure predation. I watched, hidden in the shadows, my blood running cold. In a straight fight, even one-on-one, I would be torn to shreds. My strength was subtle, defensive. Theirs was explosive and savage. Dejected and terrified, I made my way back to the house, the reality of my situation crashing down on me. I couldn't outfight them. But as I sat at the desk, staring at Audrey's maps, an idea began to form. My gaze fell on a thin blue line that snaked its way down from the hills to the coast, a line she had marked with a special symbol. Silver Creek, the label read. The water runs over a rich, natural silver deposit, Audrey had told me. The concentration is so high that animals won't drink from it. The old stories say it's poison to the moonhounds. A touch is like a brand, a mouthful is death. I looked from the map to the silver dagger on the desk. I wasn't a brawler. I wasn't a soldier. I was a photographer. I knew how to frame a shot, how to use the environment, how to anticipate where the subject would be. I couldn't beat them with strength, but maybe, just maybe, I could outsmart them. I wasn't a hunter, but that didn't mean I couldn't build a better trap. The plan was desperate, a thin thread of strategy woven from folklore and fear. Audrey was against it at first. "It's too risky, Kaylin," she'd insisted, her voice tight with concern as we sat in the dimly lit kitchen. "You're asking to be the fox in a dog hunt." "I'm already the fox, Audrey," I'd replied, my voice harder than I intended. "The difference is, this time I get to choose the hunting ground." Reluctantly, she agreed to help. We spent the next day preparing. She showed me the fastest, most treacherous path to Silver Creek on the map, a winding deer trail that would be difficult for a man to navigate, let alone a 7-foot-tall monster. My newfound agility would be my only advantage. The goal was simple: lure Lachlan and his inner circle away from the full pack and lead them on a chase straight into the one place on this god-forsaken coast that was poison to them. The bait had to be irresistible. It had to be personal. That evening, as dusk bled across the sky, I took one of Alara's heavy kitchen knives and walked to the shattered living room window. My hand trembled as I held it over a large, sharp shard of glass that was still embedded in the frame. This was it. No turning back. I took a deep, steadying breath and drew the blade across my forearm. The cut was deep, the pain sharp and clean. Dark blood, almost black in the fading light, welled up instantly. I let it drip onto the shard of glass, a deliberate, unmistakable offering. The coppery scent, magnified 100-fold to my own senses, filled the air. To them, it must be like a siren's song. Then, without a backward glance, I slipped out the back of the house and sprinted for the tree line, melting into the shadows. The hunt was on. I found a spot on a ridge overlooking the house, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The woods were unnervingly silent, a held breath before a scream. It didn't take long. A low, guttural growl drifted up from the direction of the house, followed by an excited, savage snarl. They'd found the scent. I didn't wait to see them. I turned and ran, plunging deeper into the forest, following the path Audrey and I had mapped out. The chase began in earnest. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the undergrowth with a recklessness I couldn't afford. They weren't trying to be silent. They were running me down like a locomotive. A full-throated, terrifying roar echoed through the trees. Lachlan's voice, I was certain of it. A sound of pure, triumphant rage. They thought I was fleeing in terror. Let them. I pushed myself harder, my body moving with a speed and grace that still felt alien. I vaulted over fallen logs, ducked under low-hanging branches, my feet barely seeming to touch the damp earth. The world was a blur of dark tree trunks and shifting shadows, my senses screaming with information. I could hear the pounding of their heavy footfalls behind me, the splintering of wood as they powered through obstacles I had to circumvent. They were closing the distance. A clawed hand swiped at my back, missing by inches and tearing a long strip of fabric from my jacket. The air was filled with their panting, a hot, fetid stench of wet fur and raw meat. I gambled, veering off the main path and into a dense thicket of thorns. The barbs tore at my clothes and skin, but I gritted my teeth and pushed through. I heard roars of frustration behind me as the larger beasts were forced to slow down, to tear their way through. It bought me precious seconds. I burst out of the thicket and saw it ahead. A slight shimmer in the moonlight, the faint sound of running water. Silver Creek. The creek was about 15 feet across, not deep, but the water flowing over the smooth, dark stone seemed to glow with a faint, sickly luminescence. The air around it felt cold, carrying a sharp, metallic tang. I didn't slow down. I gathered myself and leaped, clearing the water and landing with a roll on the far bank, scrambling behind a large, moss-covered boulder. I peered over the edge. My breath held tight in my chest. A moment later, the first two werewolves burst from the tree line. They were moving so fast, so consumed by the bloodlust of the chase that they didn't see the creek until it was too late. The lead beast, a massive brute with dark, matted fur, plunged its front paws into the water with a triumphant snarl. The snarl instantly turned into a high-pitched, agonized shriek. Smoke, thick and white, billowed from the water as if it were acid. The creature threw itself backward, howling in pain, its forelimbs blackened and charred, the fur and flesh sloughing off the bone. The second one, skidding to a halt at the edge, was splashed by the water. It yelped as if struck by a hot iron, scrambling back from the bank, its leg smoking where the droplets had landed. Then Lachlan appeared. He was larger than the others, a monster of muscle and gray fur, his yellow eyes burning with incandescent fury. He stopped dead at the bank, his massive chest heaving. He saw his injured pack mates, then his gaze locked onto me, hiding behind the boulder. The raw, animalistic hunger in his eyes was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying, cold, calculating intelligence. He understood. This wasn't a panicked flight. This was a deliberate, calculated trap. He threw his head back and let out a roar that was not of frustration, but of pure, unadulterated hatred. This was no longer just a hunt for a prize. Now it was personal. He knew I was not just prey. I was a rival. Lachlan's retaliation was swift and brutally effective. He understood he couldn't take my fortress by storm, so he decided to starve me out. The change was palpable overnight. The overt, monstrous threats were replaced by a chillingly human strategy. The following morning, I tried to drive into town for supplies, only to find a massive pine tree felled across the end of my road. It wasn't a storm casualty. The cuts were clean, made by a chainsaw. Two of Lachlan's mill workers were there, ostensibly clearing it. They gave me slow, insolent grins. "Road's out, friend," one of them said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "Probably be a day or two." He was applying pressure, cutting me off from the outside world. The next target was Audrey. I called her, my voice urgent. "Stay home, lock your doors, he knows you're helping me." It was too late. "They were here, Kaylin," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. Smashed the front window of the library. Just a rock, but it was a message. This morning there was a dead crow on my doorstep. They weren't trying to harm her, not yet. They were showing me that my actions had consequences, that my defiance would bring suffering to the only person who had shown me kindness. The guilt was a physical weight. The town itself became an extension of my prison. On my one successful trip before the road was blocked, the atmosphere had shifted from cold hostility to open menace. People who had once just stared now turned their backs on me. Whispers followed me down the aisle of the general store. The town sheriff, a large man with a gut that spilled over his belt and eyes that were clearly in Lachlan's pocket, cornered me by the checkout counter. "Listen, Halt," he'd said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "There's been a lot of trouble since you showed up. Animal attacks, property damage. Folks are spooked. I'd strongly advise you to stay on your property until this all blows over." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order, backed by the full corrupt weight of local law. Lachlan Cormac owned this town, body and soul. Days turned into a week. My supplies dwindled. The canned goods I had were running low, and the tap water started tasting stale. The physical toll was worse. My unique physiology, I was discovering, required more energy than a normal human's. The hunger I felt wasn't for food, but for something more fundamental. I felt a growing weakness, a lethargy that seeped into my bones. The siege was working. I was trapped, isolated, and growing weaker by the day. Despair began to set in, a cold, creeping fog that was more oppressive than any Maine weather. One night, driven by a gnawing hunger and a sense of hopelessness, I was pacing the cellar, running my hands along the cold, damp stone walls. My fingers brushed against a section of the foundation that felt different. Not stone, but wood. It was a small, cleverly disguised door, its edges perfectly flush with the surrounding rock. With a surge of adrenaline, I pried it open. It swung inward with a low groan, revealing a dark, narrow tunnel. The air that flowed out was ancient and cold, carrying the scent of deep earth and salt. My ancestors weren't just paranoid. They were geniuses of survival. They had built an escape route. The tunnel, clearly hand-dug, led into a series of natural sea caves carved into the base of the cliff the house stood on. It was a secret world, a back door to the ocean itself. And inside the largest cave, tucked into a dry alcove, was another iron-bound chest. This one was smaller, more personal. Inside, I found not weapons, but another diary. The handwriting was different, more masculine and severe. It was my grandfather's. I'd never known him. He had died before I was born. His entries were less emotional than Ilara's, more like a military field manual. He wrote about the siege tactics the Cormac family had used against him decades ago. But then he wrote about something else, a last resort. He spoke of a ritual, a way to lull the blood to sleep, to sever the connection to the night and become fully human again. He described it as a profound loss, a surrender, but a necessary one if the line was to survive in secret. The key to the ritual, he wrote, was an artifact, a sort of catalyst, which he had hidden for safekeeping in the one place he believed the moonhounds would never dare defile. A secret chamber beneath the old, decommissioned lighthouse at the edge of the point. A choice crystallized in the damp, cold air of the cave, stark and absolute. I could use this escape route to flee, to find the artifact, and try to erase this part of myself, leaving Audrey and the town to Lachlan's mercy. Or I could stay and fight. Could I live with myself, knowing I had run, knowing I had abandoned the only person who had helped me? The weakness in my limbs was overshadowed by a sudden burning clarity. The hunger, the fear, the isolation, it all fell away, replaced by a singular purpose. I wasn't going to the lighthouse to run away. I was going to find a weapon. The decision settled in my soul like a stone. I would not surrender this part of myself. It was my inheritance, my birthright. My grandfather may have seen the ritual as a necessary escape, but I saw it as a betrayal of everything our ancestors had endured. I would face Lachlan not as a frightened human trying to escape a curse, but as his equal, his opposite. The last of the Nightkin. Using the sea cave tunnel was my only option. Under the cloak of a moonless, fog-shrouded night, I slipped out of the cave onto a narrow, rocky beach at the base of the cliff. The air was cold and sharp with the smell of low tide. I was an escapee from my own fortress, moving like a ghost through the darkness Lachlan thought he controlled. My senses, though dulled by hunger, were still sharper than any human's. I could hear the 2 sentries Lachlan had posted on the road above, their low conversation and the crackle of their radio, and I moved in the opposite direction. The path to the old lighthouse wound its way along the coast, forcing me to cross the town's ancient cemetery. The place was a forest of tilting, weathered headstones, their names and dates erased by centuries of salt and wind. Audrey had told me this place was considered neutral ground by an old, unspoken truce between the 2 kin. Here, amongst the dead, the living war was supposed to be suspended. Lachlan, it seemed, no longer cared for tradition. They were waiting for me among the tombstones. 3 of them. They didn't transform, not fully. They remained in their human forms, but the predatory stillness, the faint yellow glow in their eyes, left no doubt as to what they were. This wasn't an attempt to kill me. It was a test, a roadblock. Lachlan was probing my defenses, trying to see how weak the siege had made me. "Cormac wants to see you, Halt," the leader, a burly man with a scarred face, snarled. "Says you can make this easy on yourself." "I'm not going anywhere with you," I said, my hand tightening on the silver dagger hidden in my jacket. They attacked. It was a clumsy, brutal assault, all fists and fury. They were stronger than normal men, but they were not the monsters I had faced in the woods. They were holding back, underestimating me. The hunger and weakness I'd been feeling were burned away in a sudden explosive rush of adrenaline and instinct. I didn't fight like a man. I moved like something else. I ducked under a wild swing, the air whispering past my ear, and drove the pommel of my dagger into the man's gut. He gasped and doubled over. A second man grabbed me from behind, his arms like steel bands. For a moment his strength was overwhelming, but then, that other part of me, the ancient blood, took over. I didn't just struggle. I erupted. I drove my heel back into his knee with a sickening crunch and twisted free, the sound of his pained howl music to my ears. I didn't kill them. I didn't need to. I was faster, more fluid. I used their own momentum against them, weaving between their attacks, delivering sharp, incapacitating blows. I broke a wrist, dislocated a shoulder. Within a minute, 2 of them were on the ground, groaning in pain, and the third was backing away, his eyes wide with a fear he hadn't expected to feel. I let him go. The message would be delivered. I was not broken. The lighthouse stood at the very tip of the point, a skeletal finger of stone and iron pointing at the sky. It had been abandoned for 50 years. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the dust of ages. Following my grandfather's instructions from the diary, I found a loose flagstone in the floor at the base of the circular staircase. Beneath it was a small, lead-lined box. My heart pounded as I lifted the lid. This was it, the key to ending the nightmare. But it wasn't an amulet. It wasn't a mystical charm for a ritual. It was a weapon. Lying on a bed of faded velvet was a heavy, beautiful, old-fashioned revolver, a Colt Peacemaker, its silver chasing gleaming even in the faint moonlight. Beside it were 6 cartridges, their tips also gleaming silver. And tucked beneath the gun was a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a note from my grandfather. His handwriting was steady, resolute. "Kaylin, if you are reading this, then the old truce has failed. I wrote of the ritual in my diary as a test of your character. A true Halt would never choose to extinguish the flame. This is your birthright. It is not a curse to be cured, but a weapon to be wielded. Sometimes the only way to quiet the echo in your own blood is to silence the blood of your enemy for good." A profound, chilling sense of understanding washed over me. My ancestors had never intended to run. They had never intended to surrender. They had been preparing for this day, for this final confrontation. The gun felt heavy and real in my hand, a cold promise of finality. The path forward was no longer shrouded in fog. I had a new purpose. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about eradication. I returned to the house through the sea caves just before dawn, the weight of the silver-inlaid Colt a cold, reassuring presence against my back. The failed ambush had enraged Lachlan. The psychological games were over. He was done testing me. Now, he would break me. The ultimatum came that afternoon, not via a phone call or a note, but through the town sheriff. He arrived at the now cleared roadblock, his face pale and sweaty. He wouldn't look me in the eye. "He has her, Halt," the sheriff mumbled, staring at his boots. "Cormac has Audrey Pendergast. He took her from her home this morning. He says you're to come to the mill, alone, by midnight. Surrender yourself, and he'll let her live. If you don't." He trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. He turned and practically fled to his cruiser, leaving me alone with the sickening news. Rage, cold and pure, unlike anything I had ever felt, washed through me. He had crossed the final line. Audrey was a non-combatant, a keeper of history. By taking her, Lachlan had broken every ancient rule. He had made this a war without honor, and he had given me my opening. He thought he was setting a trap for me, but he had just told me exactly where he would be, consolidating his forces in one location. He had brought the heart of his operation, his hostage, to the battlefield of his own choosing. A fatal mistake. As darkness fell, a blood-red harvest moon began to rise over the ocean, painting the fog in apocalyptic hues. The night itself felt charged, electric. I made my preparations. I laid out the silver daggers. I loaded the Colt, the silver-tipped cartridges sliding into the cylinder with 6 satisfying clicks. Finally, I took one of the vials of dark concentrate from the cellar chest. I had been saving it, fearing its effects. Now was the time. I uncorked it and drank the thick, metallic-tasting liquid in one swallow. The effect was instantaneous. A fire ignited in my veins, every nerve ending singing with power. The world snapped into an impossible level of focus. The muted sounds of the night became a symphony. My body felt light, coiled, thrumming with a power that bordered on painful. I was more than I had ever been, and I knew it would not last. I didn't use the road. I used the forest, moving through the trees like a wraith. The lumber mill was a sprawling complex of dark, skeletal buildings and towering stacks of logs, all bathed in the eerie crimson light of the moon. The air hummed with the low thrum of a generator and the stench of sawdust and pine resin, and something else, the thick animal scent of the pack. They were everywhere, lurking in the shadows between the lumber piles, their yellow eyes glowing like embers in the dark. I needed a diversion. I circled the perimeter, my movements utterly silent, until I found what I was looking for. A massive, open-sided shed packed to the rafters with dry wood shavings and sawdust. A single spark was all it would take. I found a can of gasoline in the back of a maintenance truck, doused one end of the shed, and struck a match. The fire went up with a deafening whoosh, a column of orange flame tearing into the night sky. Shouts and panicked growls erupted from all over the mill. As I'd hoped, a significant portion of the pack, their animal instincts overriding their discipline, broke ranks and raced towards the inferno. It was the chaos I needed. I slipped through the now thinner cordon of guards and made my way towards the main sawmill building, a vast cavernous structure where the huge bandsaws were housed. Inside, I found them. Lachlan stood in the center of the room, still in his human form, his massive frame radiating menace. He held Audrey in front of him, one thick arm clamped around her chest, a large hunting knife held to her throat. She was terrified, but her eyes were defiant. "I knew you'd come, Halt," Lachlan snarled, a triumphant predatory grin spreading across his face. "The blood always calls to the weak of heart." "Let her go, Cormac," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "This is between you and me. It always has been." Lachlan laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "It ends tonight. Your blood will finally give us peace, or power. I find I no longer care which." With a shove, he pushed Audrey towards two of his men. "Take her, he's mine." As they dragged her away, Lachlan's body began to contort. Bones snapped and reformed with sickening cracks, his skin stretching and tearing as coarse gray fur sprouted from it. His transformation was a masterpiece of biological violence, and in seconds, the man was gone, replaced by the 7-foot-tall monster, the alpha of the Moonhounds. He charged. He was a hurricane of claws and fangs, expecting to overwhelm me with sheer brutal force. But the concentrate was singing in my blood. I was faster. I dove to the side and he smashed into a stack of massive timbers, sending them scattering like toothpicks. I couldn't match his strength, so I wouldn't try. This had to be a battle of wits. I led him on a deadly dance through the machinery of the mill. He swiped at me, his claws gouging deep furrows in the steel housing of a saw. I ducked under the blow and kicked a lever, sending a heavy logging chain swinging down from a winch, catching him in the chest and staggering him. He roared in fury and lunged again. I scrambled up a catwalk, and he followed, his weight making the metal structure groan. I vaulted over the railing, dropping 10 feet to the floor below, and pulled another lever as I landed. A conveyor belt roared to life, and the log he was standing on began to move, carrying the snarling, off-balance beast towards the massive, silent blade of the main saw. He leaped off at the last second, landing in a crouch. He was learning, adapting. He stopped charging wildly and began to stalk me, his movements more deliberate, cutting off my escape routes. He was hurting me. He backed me into a corner, his yellow eyes burning with the certainty of victory. He lunged, a final killing blow. But he'd hurted me exactly where I wanted to go. My back, was against the wall where I had left my jacket. As he came at me, I spun, my hand grabbing the butt of the Colt. Time seemed to slow. I saw his claws extending, his jaws snapping open, filled with dagger-like teeth. I brought the gun up, the silver barrel gleaming in the moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. I fired. The sound of the shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The silver bullet struck him square in the chest. It didn't just punch a hole. It exploded with a flash of white light, a violent supernatural reaction between the cursed flesh and the pure metal. Lachlan was thrown backward as if hit by a truck, a massive cauterized wound smoking in the center of his chest. He stared at me, his burning yellow eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He tried to rise, let out one last gurgling roar that turned into a pathetic whimper, and then collapsed, the life fading from his eyes. The Alpha was dead. The death of an Alpha is not a quiet thing. A psychic shock wave seemed to ripple out from the sawmill, a wave of panic and despair that struck every member of the pack. The howls of bloodlust from outside were replaced by yelps of confusion and fear. The pack's rigid hierarchy, held together by Lachlan's iron will, shattered in an instant. The link was broken. When I emerged from the sawmill, helping a shaken but unharmed Audrey, the scene was one of chaos. The fire was raging, but the werewolves were no longer a coordinated army. They were just frightened, leaderless beasts. They scattered, melting back into the darkness of the forest, fleeing the scene of their leader's demise. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to pierce the ever-present fog as Audrey and I drove away from the burning mill. The red light of the blood moon had faded, replaced by the cool, clean gray of a new day. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. We had survived the night. The days that followed were strange and quiet. Port Fog held its breath. The disappearance of Lachlan Cormack, officially investigated by a now powerless sheriff as a tragic accident in the mill fire, sent tremors through the town. The night's terrors ceased completely. The howls fell silent. The oppressive, watchful feeling that had blanketed the town was gone. When I went to the general store now, the locals didn't look at me with hostility or menace. They looked at me with a new, fearful respect. They didn't know what had happened, not exactly, but they knew who had walked into the fire and who had walked out. They knew the storm had broken the night I arrived, and now the long nightmare was over. I felt a change in myself, too. The sickness, as Ilara had called it, no longer felt like a disease or a curse. The constant low-grade tension of being hunted was gone, and in its place was a sense of calm, of control. The heightened senses, the quiet strength. They weren't alien intrusions anymore. They were simply me. The power, which had been forced to the surface by fear, had now settled, integrating itself into my very being. I hadn't been cured. I had been made whole. A week later, Audrey and I sat on the porch of the old house, watching the gray waves of the Atlantic crash against the rocks below. The iron bolts were still on the doors, but they no longer felt like the restraints of a prison. They felt like a symbol of resilience. "The balance is restored for now," Audrey said, her voice soft but firm. "Without an alpha, the pack is broken. They will be little more than animals for a long time, squabbling among themselves, too disorganized to be a unified threat." She turned to look at me, her gaze steady and knowing. "But the forest is never truly safe. There will always be lone hunters. There will always be a risk. This place will always need a watcher." I looked out at the ocean, at the vast, foggy horizon. I came here as Halt, a photographer from Denver, a pragmatist looking to liquidate an asset, and return to my simple, logical life. I thought I was inheriting a house. I was wrong. I had inherited a duty. This house, this cliff, this town shrouded in mist. It was my territory now, my responsibility, my home. The man from Denver was gone, a faded photograph from another lifetime. I was the last of the Halt line, the guardian of Port Fog. I picked up Alara's diary from the small table beside me, its leather cover worn smooth by the hands of generations. I opened it to the first blank page at the end and uncapped a pen. I had my own chapter to write. Night was beginning to fall, the shadows lengthening, the world softening into shades of gray and black that were now more comforting to me than the harsh light of day. I felt no fear. I felt no urge to seek a cure or run from my legacy. I had found my place. The darkness was my ally now,